Okay, so welcome to this last paper session of our conference. The first speaker today is Cameron Vaziri, who is a graduate student at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, America. He has an MA from Johns Hopkins University in International Relations. He's interested in French postmodernism and critical analysis of such issues as identity, international politics, environmental ethics, and video games. And today, Cameron will speak on press pause to play, stopping the video game as post-structuralist engagement. The floor is yours.
Yeah. I'm going to start with sharing the PowerPoint just so that way I don't have to come back to it. But let's see. All right. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
Yeah, we see it well.
Funnily enough, I don't see it. I don't know why it's like disappeared on me. There we go. Okay, now I do. All right. So as I sat down to write this paper, I looked up and noticed across from me were three sets of double-sided shelves about 20 feet long that comprise the local public library's collection of mystery novels. Each book contained within its pages the answer to its riddle, the who that did it. I have not read these books, nor will I, nor do they need me to read them. If a book contains a mystery and no one is around to read it, the mystery is still solved. Espen Arseth's book, Cybertext, constructs a genre and method of literary analysis for video games, which he calls ergodic literature. In his conclusion, Arseth distinguishes between ergodic literature and the mystery novel. For the reader of the detective novel, the mystery is revealed in the standard course of the reading. Even if the reader engages in the activity of trying to solve the case, this in no way influences the outcome for the novel. On the other hand, for the player of a detective adventure game, the anamorphic dilemma dominates the experience completely as a player tries to change the work from one state, unsolved, to another, solved. There is a clear, perceptible distinction between these two states, and typically, once the mystery is resolved, the work loses its enigmatic aura and usually the player's interest along with it. Ergodic literature is defined by the essential role the reader or player serves in the traversal of the text. In other words, the text's narrative or story is not independent of the reader-player's contributive efforts. This opens the cybertext to interpretive and political analyses of the relationship between the author-designer and the reader-player that can offer a post-structuralist challenge to the game's meta-narrative. However, while what Eric Hyatt and Edward West call a player's style may offer this post-structuralist critique of the game's politics, they do not engage such a criticism of the game's narrative structure. This paper seeks to offer that challenge, that ergodic literature not only on the level of content may offer a post-structuralist critique, but it does so at the level of literary form. In other words, by taking the role of the player's choice a bit further than Arseth does, specifically through the use of game stoppage and the creation of alternative win conditions, ergodic literature can break with what I'll refer to as the structural semiotics of literature, specifically at the level of its teleological determinism. The conventional novel follows a trajectory towards its conclusion. The mystery and investigation leads to the discovery of the culprit. The pathway from which the novel's opening arrives at the end may be singular or varied, but ultimately, the conclusion is predetermined. This ending serves as a payoff for having endured the journey. Yet the work is done for the reader by the author. The clues discovered and analyzed, the interrogations conducted, the mystery solved. The payoff is the sense of finality and the new understandings which the reader gains to retroactively provide clarity to the story. This retroactivity can be both within and without the story. Within, in the sense of the explanation of elements previously not understood due to the lack of concluding information, the meaning and significance of the foreshadowing, and the logic of the plot's development. Outside of the text itself, the impact of the story's development and the evolution of symbolic meaning translates to the reader's lived experience as described in Paul Ricoeur's mimetic circle. The mimetic circle contains three elements. Mimesis 1 is the prefigurative borrowing of the descriptive symbolism from the real world into the story. Mimesis 2 is configurational. the story's development, influence, and alteration of these symbolic meanings through implotment. And mimesis 3 is a refiguration of the world through the impact of implotment on the reader. The role of the conclusion is paramount in providing meaning both in and outside of the story. This is distinct from the dichotomy of linear or nonlinear narratives. Parallel or multivariable paths still rely on some concluding element that offers value and explanation for the tumultuous journey. This is what I refer to as the teleological determinism that underlies literary structuralism. Ergodic literature is not in opposition to this structure. Indeed, Arseth largely maintains it with his focus on win conditions. In doing so, he utilizes two concepts, aporia and epiphany. Aporia are the obstacles within the game that hinder the reader player's ability to satisfy the win conditions. This introduces to the game three time dimensions. First is the audience time, that which is experienced by the player outside of the story. Second is ergodic time, the in-game experience of temporal progression. And finally, negotiated time, which arises from the interaction between the other two. As a game offers a challenge to the reader player's progress, the text offers a unique experience of replayability. Unlike a conventional novel, this repetition is marked by difference. A new approach by the player is taken after a failed attempt to correct their action to overcome this obstacle. As such, a new story is written in place of the prior failed attempt. Practice runs not only reveal failed tactics, but can also develop a player's skill outside of ergodic time. Epiphany is the experience of accomplishment that comes with successfully navigating and overcoming the aporia. This conclusion offers meaning and value to the play experience, the satisfaction of catching the culprit of the detective game, and not merely having their identity revealed to you, as in the mystery novel. In this structure, the concluding epiphany is still constructed by the game designer. What Arseth does not discuss is what happens when these win conditions are set by the player, especially in highly ergodic video games. Ergodicism is a matter of degrees, where some games are more ergodic than others. For example, a game such as Hogwarts Legacy offers substantially more player influence in the development of symbolic meaning than Pong. So too are some games more textual. Compared to a non-textual game such as football, which has only action, i.e. ergodic elements, the computer game has both ergotics, action, and descriptions, graphics, and sounds, but not narration, since the event space is not fixed before the time of play. Thus, a computer game is textual in that it has description, unlike football, but it is not narrated, since there is no such thing as the unfolding of a predetermined story. The ergodic level usually dominates the descriptive. The story or narrative is a post hoc construct fitted over the experience by virtue of its conclusion. The co-developed story by the reader player and the author designer that appears when the win conditions are satisfied and the end scene is triggered. This is where I break with Arseth. There is a direct correlation with a game's degree of ergodicism and its post-structuralist potential, or inversely, and less ironically put, its capacity to break with structural semiotics. I wish to explore video games without the teleological determinism, the retroactive narrativization of the experience of play by virtue of satisfying the game designer's win condition. To do so, we'll look at some basic models of games and analyze how the player can use their power as ergodic co-author to challenge literary structuralism. We can imagine ergodic video games as a series of possibilities in various formats. And these are what I'm showing in the PowerPoint. The first I'll refer to as the flowchart model, in which the choices a reader player makes alters the course of the storyline through which they progress to an ending that is informed by those choices. An example of such a game is Detroit: Become Human, in which the player guides 3 android characters through a complex decision tree that can result in up to 85 different endings with various levels of distinction between them. Another common form is the checkpoint model, in which the game progresses linearly from checkpoint to checkpoint until the game's ultimate endpoint at the win condition. However, the manner by which the reader player progresses between checkpoints is up to their determination. A game such as Halo Combat Evolved reflects this model, where the player can navigate the means by which they complete each level. For example, will they play using stealth or by eradicating all enemies? But ultimately, the story progresses level by level through the game designer's narrative development. Many games employ a combination of these two formats, a hybrid model where choices determine a narrative flow along a flowchart path, and between these choices, which can mark checkpoint zones, the player is in more complete control of how the story progresses via their style of play. These formats all borrow from narrative literature in that they employ a teleological determinism. However, because of ergodicism, the reader-player can break these narratives. The flowchart model offers an interesting example of such a break. Completionist playstyles break the aporia-epiphany relationship. These reader-players attempt to see all endings rather than to play via embodying the game's protagonists. This is an example of an alternative win condition to that of the game's author-designer. Other examples include challenges that focus on completing the game under more rigorous conditions, such as solo runs for Pokemon games or the Halo 2 Lasso challenge. Such challenges remove the narratively constructed epiphany set by the author-designer in favor of the player's own without a real literary, as in novel, parallel, as there is no reading, for example, a book with only its vowels. The completionist run of a game such as Detroit Become Human, as was done by Throwaway Deviant 9, who posted all flowcharts and stats in the game's subreddit, breaks down the aporia epiphany relationship in a different way. With the goal of experiencing all endings, the game's obstacle in the decision-making process of gameplay is functionally nullified. Normally, the challenge of a game is maintaining a close character structure maintaining a chosen character structure while facing conflicting entanglements as the storyline progresses. For example, a reader player may choose to have the protagonist be a good guy by choosing the most ethical options at every decision point in the flowchart. The aporia arises in the ethical dilemmas the story will force the reader player to confront that may limit these options. The consequence of such a choice the consequences of each choice and the potential of unexplored paths invoke a sense of significance to each decision that makes the game thrilling. Completionism removes this aporia, as the struggle or work of the gameplay is merely to account for all possibilities over time. No decision has consequences. In other words, there is no real aporia, and instead the game experience is pure epiphany. With the checkpoint model, as there is less ergodicism at play in the narrative development, there is also less ability to change the game's form. However, Erseth identifies one such method without realizing its meaningful potential. The experience of aporia and the potential need to replay sections that prove difficult does not always result in the player eventually finding the path to success. Sometimes, players will abandon the game. Erseth addresses this possibility by recognizing the potential for a solution, but never returns to the question of what happens to the story of an abandoned game. After all, the potential solution or solutions are never realized, and thus no retroactive narrative meaning is constructed out of the completion of the level's win condition. However, that does not mean a story does not exist. Instead, it is simply a rejection of the game's teleological structure, a Bartleby-esque preferring not to play. The game thus becomes pure aporia and no epiphany. With a limited ergodicism, the meaning of such a political rebuttal to the narrative structure may be limited, but it is not without consequence, particularly outside of the game. Part of the controversy surrounding the release of the game Cuphead was the result of the criticism of the game's difficulty and the promotion by game critics of accessibility in a product which reader players ostensibly own, but may not have the ability to fully experience. More ergodic games offer an even better example of the potential for these two critiques. Of a game's narrative structure, the creation of alternative win conditions, and the termination of story development. The highly ergodic model crudely resembles the checkpoint model in that there are beginning and end points. What distinguishes them is the lack of intermediary points that minimize the effect of any given decision in a storyline development. Additionally, like the flowchart model, there may be multiple potential endings for the game. An example of such a game would be Sid Meier's Civilization VI, in which there are multiple potential win conditions, scientific, cultural, religious, diplomatic victories, and so on, but no other interruption in the development of the story from the start to the finish. Some games lack even this structural element, such as with the McDonald video game, which had no win condition or endpoint, but continues to infinity until the player abandons the game or fails. For many games with endpoints like Civ 6, continued gameplay is often an option even after hitting the term limit or satisfying the win condition. The sheer quantity of story development determined by the reader player enables two exemplary examples of post-structuralist gameplay forms. First is the creation of an alternative win condition in place of or supplementary to the author designers. An example in Civ 6 is the attempt to build all the game's wonders. Second is how much storyline exists with an abandoned game. These both allow the achievements of Hyatt and Webster rejection of mimetically reflected stereotypes in strategy without needing to satisfy win conditions with a contrarian style. As such, style does not need to succeed to offer its post-structuralist critique of content. After all, the creation of alternative win conditions allows for the style to succeed potentially independent of the harms of combating against the game's implicit strategy. Regarding the abandonment of the game, here the distinction between ergodic literature and the classic novel reveals its import. An abandoned book has no impact on the progression of the story to its ultimate narrative conclusion. The whodunit remains independent of the reader. However, in the game, that is not necessarily the case. The abandoned storyline does not necessarily, and particularly so in this model, indicate a failed attempt. The potential for success remains open, and the lack of failure indicates at the least a success to that point. As a result, the possibility for the alternative of style to strategy indicates the lack of necessity to follow the game's mimetic prefiguration and configuration. The lack of progression also breaks the narrative structure, in that the teleological determinism remains unfulfilled, but with this critique of content, the gameplay is not meaningless. In contrast to the saved gameplay that our Seth discusses that can be shared once the game is completed, partially completed games can not only be shared as video, but as a save file to enable the myriad of reader-player experiences from one reader-player pause point. This not only breaks up the potential aporias by allowing for others with superior skill sets to overcome insurmountable challenges, provided the abandoned storyline was done so for this reason, it also removes the contingency of epiphany upon a reader player's individual success. Not only can they witness alternative successes from the pause point they created, but the epiphany can be relocated to the point of abandonment in the sense of the revelation of the potential of style to serve as an alternative to strategy up to that point in the game. With the indeterminacy of the satisfaction of the game's conventional win conditions, the mere completion up to the point of abandonment marks success. These alternative engagement modes challenge Arceth's aporia epiphany dualism, not by abandoning or contradicting the ergodic model, but through its exemplification. In doing so, they remove the retroactive element that creates the narrative structure, instead offering a challenge to the teleological determinism that establishes the literary structure. To be clear, this is not intended to be a holistic accounting, either in the sense that the identified structuralism is universal to all literature, nor that the game models described or the forms of post-structuralism engagement, post-structural engagement with them is limited to what has been discussed here. Rather, the focus is the attempt to discern how examples of post-structuralist engagement is not limited to a criticism of content, but also of form, in addition to being an exemplar of ergodicism. Given these caveats, my attempt was to demonstrate that ergodicism enables the reader-player to break with the conventional literary structure, which offers a compulsion upon the player to satisfy externally determined conditions to mark the success of their story. The significance of this is twofold. First, as mentioned, it's the potential for a post-structuralist form of the game. Second, however, is as a response to the criticism that may be leveraged against Hyatt and West regarding the political challenge to content, specifically that when style runs in opposition to strategy, the added difficulty may render the game impossible, at least for the given player, and thus instead of serving as a challenge to mimetically reflected stereotypes, the game would most likely serve to reify these problematic structures. Through the adoption of alternative win conditions, the ability to share pause points, and the recognition of the value of abandoned games as indeterminate successes rather than abject failures, a myriad of solutions to the strategy problem exists precisely through the challenge to form rather than a pure focus on content. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Cameron. That was highly interesting for us, a novel area of research, and particularly when you bring in the issue of pausing and silencing. We will now move on directly to my good friend, I must say, Dr. Jytte Holmqvist, who is now, from what I understand, a lecturer at Lund University in Sweden, the very venerable institution. Is that right, Jytte?
That's correct. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. She also has been teaching at University of Central Lancashire in the UK, Hebei University in China, and at University of Melbourne, I believe, in Australia. She has a PhD in screen and media culture and literature in Spanish in 2015. She's interested in screen and media studies, film studies, urban geography, cultural studies, and many more things, including philosophy. And today, Jytte will speak on Claire Keegan's films, Expressing the Truth in the Silence Between Words. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Lovely. Thank you so much. Can you hear me properly, everyone? Yeah. Okay, I'll just share my screen and see if it's possible to share it. If I can share the whole screen rather than just a bit of it. Is it possible to see the whole screen if I do like this?
Yeah, we can see your slides, your PowerPoint now.
The whole thing, yeah. Great. All right, so thank you so much, Torge. I appreciate it. And Torge and I, by the way, are also co-editors for an upcoming volume on Ingmar Bergman, who is the master of silence and pauses and not saying too much at all in persona, for example. So we invite you to participate by October at some point to send in your abstracts. We can talk about that later, perhaps. But just to make a little promotion for that as well. Anyway, as Torge said, I'll try to keep to 20 minutes. I might go over about 3 minutes or something, but I have just recently taken up a position as lecturer in Spanish film in Lund University, but I have lived most of my life in the last 12 years, that is, in Melbourne. Prior to that, New Zealand, etc. It's a pleasure to be here today for the second time at this conference. Only 4 years ago, 2 years ago last time. And I will be talking about Claire Keegan as the master of saying very little saying very much, very few number of lines. And she is a master at harnessing the power of brevity in a very clear, succinct way. And she says it all in the silence between the words, and even in her language, which she suggests more all the time. So we can totally read very much into her stories. So the pausing time and the pause is very much, I think, applicable to her stories as well. She has since wrote the abstract, she's come out with 4 books at this point, 5 even, I think it is, and I will develop the longer paper into also embracing those other stories. You have seen already my abstracts. I won't go into detail, but I will just say that I will talk about only one book here today called Small Things Like These. Obviously, is a pun on words because small things are not small at all. They're very much looming issues, looming large on today's on our conscience today as well. So it's it's a play on words, I would say, that title. Claire Keegan is not very much about research, it's more about storytelling. And she says, I can't explain my work, I just write stories. So she's quite peculiar, interesting, very interesting character in many ways. Part of my introduction here, I will just read from the slides twice now and then go into other comments. How do you express the unsayable, giving quiet voice, one that is all the more powerful and that becomes a resounding statement? And please tell me if I talk too fast. Of an unbearable truth to that which was once unspeakable, hushed up, and preferably relegated to the corners of historical and collective oblivion. An apparent dilemma in her short stories that speak louder than words, Keegan delivers a message that says it all and yet not, at least not at first sight. Rather than going into excessive detail, hints there is space between lines and sentences where we are urged to reflect further and probe deeper. The written thought steps out and away from the page as we run with our imagination and expand our narrative that opens up for further debate. In a carefully crafted literature and operating within an Irish setting, Keegan relentlessly ventures into murky territories and reveals truths that are recalled and brought back to our attention, the past leaving a long shadow and colliding with the present. She explores this larger truth with a vengeance, yet the power of her writing resides in her sparse and economic use of precise words that describe, highlight, and pinpoint. Killing any potential darlings, Keegan is neither too prescriptive nor overbearing. She never becomes over-explicit, nor does she recur to over-explanations. Instead, she gives credibility to a reader who is left to consider the larger impact of her stories. Intelligent and succinct, her journalistic potentially hard-boiled style sometimes that tends towards a stream of Joycean consciousness is one where we are invited into the bigger picture, allowed to add to the sentences and use our own informed judgment, connecting the dots and reaching our own conclusions. Martin Connolly notes importantly that a writer like Claire Keegan is being hailed by a large number of critics and reviewers as a groundbreaking literary phenomenon, with comparisons to aforementioned Joyce and Chekhov bandied about. Keegan has quickly become a household name, her titles hitting headlines globally. Her words strike at the core and take us by quiet storm. Her stories take us on a journey into the darkness of our own soul and mind, while at the same time Keegan touches on larger issues affecting Ireland societally, culturally, and in relation to the outside world. And I quote from I quote a sentence here: known for stories and novels that can be small and tight, yet packed with light, as well as ominous darkness, end of quote, Keegan boldly lays bare truths that we should be aware of and strive not to repeat. In powerful, small things like these, the shortest book to have been longlisted for the Booker in its entire history, and to be analyzed in conjunction, historical injustices are called into attention, yet the subtlety of her writing lies in punchlines that we could not always see coming. She says it all while expressing clear necessities and prefers to use her imagination rather than rely heavily on research. Language, she says, is older and richer than we are, and when you go in there and let go and listen, it's possible to discover something way beyond and richer than your conscious self. It seems to me that when we fail, it's because our imagination fails us. I believe this to be true of both life and literature. This statement fit for a writer whose books have been translated into more than 30 languages and whose imagination goes a long way. In Keegan's case, less is better, but in that brevity, she speaks volumes. A multi-award-winning writer, Irish writer, and member of the Aostana Irish Association or Academy of Artists and writing within an Irish context, Claire Keegan resides on Irish soil in County Wexford or Conti Loch Garman on the Wexford coast in a country which, according to census data, is now becoming less Catholic. Fueled by Irish concerns, some of her narratives are ultimately universal, and she crafts stories that take on a life of their own and that concern us all on a common human level. She draws us into a stark literary universe where, through precise third-person narrative, most oftenly, she engages and captivates, introduces scenarios, and lays bare cracks in a fraught idyll or situation that often pushes the characters to the brink of disaster. Keegan's publications, comparatively few and far between, her mastery with a short story form is the result of years spent on developing skills within a genre that she describes as synonymous with suddenness, intensity, visual impact, contemplation, and imagination. In other words, the short story allows the writer to show glimpses of changing Irish social mores and to achieve a rapid insight into these changes, particularly when compared to the more fleshly procedures of the novel. This speech examines small things like these, of which Keegan says, I'm interested in transitions, paragraph structure, in what happens between paragraphs, those leaps in time. We partially draw, and I will do that much more later on in the longer paper, on Colm Toibin, who's a fellow Irish writer, critic, and nominated new laureate for Irish fiction by the Arts Council of Ireland, who is deeply impressed by Keegan and who reveals many of his own concerns in questions asked in dialogue with her. He praises her, saying these stories are pure magic. They add using grace, intelligence, and an extraordinary ear for rhythm to the distinguished tradition of the Irish short story. They deal with Ireland now, but have a sort of a timeless edge to them, making Claire Keegan both an original and a canonical presence in Irish fiction. Keegan's most recent novel, Small Things Like These, written during the pandemic in 2023, says it all in no time. Sorry, that was probably after the pandemic. Says it all in no time at all. Set in 1985 in an Ireland of wintry darkness and institutional rigidity, while it sheds light on the trauma lasting until the closing down of their last Irish Magdalen laundry in 1996, in parallel, the story is also a cross between a dark yet tentatively hopeful Christmas tale about the power of one, a historical fiction novel, and a short atmospheric book that explores moral dilemma amidst complacency of the majority. This complete narrative of mere 116 pages and where the story is framed within a specific point in time that also paints a backdrop to the situation of Ireland at the time has a timeless quality to it. Keegan explains that, here I quote again, It could not have been set after the Ferns report, and that was a report about the Catholic Church and its allegations of abuse, was published. I think that was 1990 sometimes, as the Catholic Church had by that time lost much of its power and was collapsing. I didn't want to set it in a time before motor vehicles, because that would suggest it was something of a distant past, not a society of my own generation's making. If it was set in another time, it might not have allowed me to question and criticize the society we ourselves created, our current misogynies and fear, the cowardices and silences and perversities and survival tactics of my own generation. And in the book called So Late in the Day, Stories of Women and Men, 2023, same time as Small Things Like These, she does explore quite a lot of current misogynies and the relationship between women and men, and sometimes the distorted relationships as well. Small things like these, and here I just have some blurbs from different books about the book. Small things like these shocks and hits a nerve with audiences by disclosing the inner workings of the Irish Magdalene laundries in a bold move that makes the novel a sharp commentary on the Catholic abuse of young women often undergoing unplanned pregnancy and who were taken away and forced to work within convent walls in places near and afar. Some of these girls presumably orphans. Their status was later revealed to be largely cover-up for children cruelly snatched from their families, a topic dealt with in Jim Loach's film Origins and Sunshine from 2011. The coldly effective Magdalene laundry apparatus, stretching as far as Oceania and the Pacific Rim, Melbourne's own Abbotsford Convent, had much to account for, and the truth of the Good Shepherd laundries and its interconnected Magdalene penitents in New Zealand started to filter through the choking silence and catapulted into the present as the girls moved past silent shame and started to talk about their first-hand experiences at the hands of cruel caretakers. End of quote. I would like to show you a few slides now from the Abbotsford Convent in Melbourne, where I was only 3 weeks ago with a Chilean friend of mine. It was founded by the Sisters of the Good Shepherd in 1863, and it operated for more than 100 years through the social traumas caused by the gold rush, very much affecting Australia as well, boom and bust, the Great Depression, and 2 world wars. Over the period of a century, thousands of girls and women were placed in care of the convent, with many residing in the convent's Sacred Heart building and laboring in the on-site Magdalene laundry. So it's very beautifully positioned. However, it does contain a very dark history, and you can feel the wings of history as you enter the convent part of the.
I'm sorry, we cannot see these images, Jutta, if you are trying to show us some images now.
Oh, you can't see them? Oh, what a shame.
We only see the first slide.
PowerPoint.
Your slide,
Okay.
your PowerPoint, yeah.
Oh, well, what a shame.
Maybe you can you just like scroll down on the left side there, and then we will be able to see them, I think.
Like this? Stop sharing?
No, it's not, nothing is happening here. I see your slideshow is open, and you know, if you press F5, okay. Now it's closed again.
Okay. I'll try it. Can you see it now?
Try share screen. You need to share your screen and then start the PowerPoint.
I'll share my own screen again.
Yeah, you need to share your screen.
Okay, yeah, that's probably better. Yeah. Are you able to see the left here?
Now it says now it's on the left. Yeah, now we had it. Okay, so there it was. Now
great.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Could you see my text before?
No, we couldn't see your text before.
You couldn't see anything.
We didn't see the text, but I understand you now want to show us some images. So maybe you want to show, yeah, okay.
Okay, so if I put it in the large, the normal view,
right,
you can't really see anything. So I'll just go back to show you what I was showing before. This is the cover page. And
yeah.
Okay, so this you didn't see anything. What a shame. Anyway, this is what I said over here, and so the only way to show this is by having the non-full PowerPoint slide presentation. Anyway, so this is the book in different versions, covers, and this is what I said about the Booker Prize. And then we had the Abbotsford Convent, which looks like this in the Magdalene laundry side of it. This is quite heavy. When you go there, it's quite heavy, the atmosphere here. And they haven't touched anything. It's just left as it was that time in the 1950s. And there were a lot of women and girls being shipped over from Ireland, England, across the oceans to New Zealand and Australia as well. And these are the girls. Some of the girls here, the dormitories. Here, if you can see a bit of it at least, is a very full-on timetable. Up at dawn, crack of dawn at 6 in the morning, and then going to bed at 8, having to sleep at that time, and then getting up again. Same old story all the time. A girl says when questioned later on, 2004, in a Senate inquiry, I remember that a lady used to come and she would sit with me in a room. I found out later that this lady was my mother. When I was a little girl, I was never told this lady was my mother. And so it's a lot of hush-hush and a lot of silenced truths that didn't come out until much later. So the comment has this reflection on what really happened, real stories being shown. And it's embedded in nature, as you can see here. It's quite beautiful, everything, but it has this dark past that is very much present when you enter the comment site. And the Magdalene Norm especially. So going back to the book by Keegan, the book, Small Things Like These, is not so much about the nature of evil as the circumstances that allow it. It centers on coal and timber merchant Bill Furlong as a quietly aging lead character who reflects on his life journey and takes stock of ups and downs, highs and lows. He ultimately explores the abyss of his own soul and quietly breaks down in the face of injustices that clash with his own moral convictions, venturing away from the gradually stifling safety and predictability of his own home with a carefully arranged domestic setup that is reassuring and offers protection, but requires his discipline, care, and attention. Furlong's chance encounter at the end of the book reveals larger issues and raises ethical questions within him, forcing him to wake up to a crude, parallel reality largely ignored by his community. In Donna McKay's Smith's words, more than Furlong's quiet heroism, the book explores the silent, self-interested complicity of a whole community, which makes it possible for such cruelty to persist. In small things like these, small things are anything but small, and the damning impact of an omnipresent institutional subjects dragged into the dark underbelly of the Catholic Church is reflected in the quiet aftermath of man versus institution, where his actions compensate for that which is unsayable, but that needs urgent attention. All along, Keegan says little, but alludes all the more, Ireland itself not issuing a formal apology until 2013, when Taoiseach Enda Kelly acknowledged the more than 30,000 Irish women and girls incarcerated and forced into Catholic labour, many of whom went into labour and lost babies killed or otherwise stashed away in staggering numbers. A dark yet ultimately attentively hopeful story set in a dark, cold, wet winter where the crows seem to belong, and which is written in awe of fellow national Ted Hughes. Keegan's Small Things Like These slowly but effectively transports the reader to a different time and place. Her matter-of-fact account of the everyday makes for a narrative lull that contrasts starkly with the sudden introduction to the scene of a young mother held hostage by nuns in a castigating Catholic system, and I quote, locked into a convent shed, cold shed, leaking milk and mourning the loss of her baby, end of quote. The film based on the book effectively represents the unfolding of events and the ensuing dialogue between Furlong and Sister Carmel, taking on the symbolic role of Mother Superior. Dashing off to the convent up the hill above town on a cold and crispy winter's night to deliver coal, Furlong is intent on making this his last chore and transaction before Christmas, a season that brought out the best and the worst in people. With the angelus bell long since rung, he is only made aware of the girl's existence by sheer happenstance, but his unexpected furtive glance in her direction changes everything. A wake-up call that leads him to take a snap decision that the story now takes on a new direction that will have a lasting impact on his wife and 5 daughters waiting at home. The ending of the book leaves room for interpretation and invites new spectres into an already dark episode in Irish history, one where the truth-sayer becomes himself a new victim. As Furlong brings the girl with him, he rescues her, but in so doing he engages in an act of self-destruction, and this is the account of his breaking down. The destruction of the self happens at the level of disintegration of Furlong's identity as he now takes on a new role and persona, and it is likewise the destruction of his carefully designed family setup. His decisive act will irrevocably expose his family to the scorn and ostracization of neighbors whose silence becomes a way to shy away from the unbearable. Their inability to see means they close their eyes to reality. The worst was yet to come, he knew. Already he could feel a world of trouble waiting for him behind the next door. But the worst that could have happened was also already behind him, the thing not done, which could have been, which he would have had to live with for the rest of his life. Whatever suffering he was now to meet was a long way from what the girl at his side had already endured and might yet surpass. Climbing the street towards his own front door with the barefooted girl and the box of shoes, his fear more than outweighed every other feeling, but in his foolish heart he not only hoped, but legitimately believed that they would manage. Through his controversial yet heroic move, Furlong finds his own truth and lays bare the crimes perpetrated at the doorsteps of a close-knit community who relate to one another not through matters of the heart and soul, but through short utterances that reflect a concern with seemingly petty diurnal issues or duties that become a whole communal way of life. An unsung hero, Furlong is an embodiment of the silence surrounding the treatment of young out-of-wedlock mothers in Ireland during most part of the 20th century. Keegan uses this character as the narrator of a fragment of his life in which he rebels against the Catholic Church, the perpetrator of the abuse in the Magdalene laundries in Ireland, therefore breaking the cycle of silence. Furlong as a vehicle through whom we explore a dark chapter in Irish history is in Keegan's view more a servant than a squire. As she sees it, her main role as the writer is to listen and try to follow what is there, and I quote, discover it and putting it down as evenly as possible without exaggeration and to not ask the central character to bear any of my preoccupations. She says this in a conversation with Toybin. Keegan's slowly somber Christmas tale becomes a study in accountability and the conviction of one man to drastically change the course of events to come. With that, she indirectly and without being prescriptive urges us to stay informed, question authorities and the status quo whilst we revisit history, become aware and pledge not to forget and for history not to repeat. Given the short time I have at my disposal, which is enough anyway, I will end here just saying a few things to wrap things up in line with her own ability to say enough in a limited number of pages. In her literature to date, which I'm not sure if you can see anything here, sorry, but I do have that's the small things like this book. If you can see anything at all, Foster, that I will talk about later on. Antarctica is a fantastic collection of short stories, a very harrowing opening tale or story, which is very claustrophobic as well, and Walk the Blue Fields, and there's one more that I haven't read yet, but these are fantastic stories, all of them. Keegan takes on a journey into the unknown, into that which cannot be explained, but that is very much felt, and as we walk alongside our characters through mist and fog and cross Irish moors, we too experience the cold discomfort of being humans forced to stare into the murky abyss of our own soul. There is no looking away, there is no one to turn to, no apparent light is distinguished at the end of the tunnel. Apart from small things like these, where there is potentially some kind of light towards the end, but it comes at a cost. In Keegan's precise words to speak larger truths, we enter into sometimes fraught and dysfunctional dialogue with ourselves and with others, and as we investigate the past, that space of querying and examining history allows us to form a more complete understanding of dark chapters that have left much pain in their wake. As established by Toybin with reference to Keegan's book So Late in the Day, but where his statement can be applied to her writing philosophy in general, Claire Keegan makes the moments real and then she makes them matter. Both Keegan and Toybin demonstrate through their literature that they are capable of putting words to that which others fail to disclose or tell with astute precision. They have found a way to express the largely inexpressible, with Toybin being exceptionally candid in the autobiographical reflection that opens a series of essays in A Guest at the Feast, and which opens with his own story about his own cancer that I think he is able to overcome after that. And Keegan opting for the short story to delve straight into the danger zone, thematically speaking, and yet she does so with quiet grace. Using unpretentious, straightforward, and unemotional language, her characters come alive and step forth as complete human beings full of flaws, queries, conundrums, and ongoing ruminations. What in Jon Fosse becomes a way to express unsayable through pauses in Keegan's impactful literature is remarkable ability to bring us into tough narratives through succinct language and quick and realistic dialogues, alternated by effective descriptions that take us straight into the place of action. And in the silence that lingers in the space between her words, that which is not said is always remarkably present. If we learn to listen as we read, listen to the voice within that expresses that which may not always be present on paper. Thank you very much. This is my short list of references. and I hope you can see something at least. All right, end of PowerPoint. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ita. That was very, very interesting. I will open. Yeah, very well done. I have an opening question for you, and I will allow you to answer, and then let's open the floor for questions from others. My question to both of you actually is how your particular interventions relate to the notion of silence. To Cameron, I would ask, when you pause the game, uh, how does that relate to silence? I mean, is there a silence in the game? Who perceives that silence? Can the computer game then, is the computer game silent? And so on. Okay, so I will just leave it at that, and maybe you can think about some kind of response to that. And to Jytte, I noticed that the silence in small things like these, and maybe in Keegan's stories, in general, are a kind of silencing, right? I mean, it's like there are, for example, you say like silence appears as a form of violence that should be broken, something like that, right? So there are things that have been silenced that there should not be a silence about anymore. The silence should be broken, and we should again be able to speak about it. So this is one kind of notion of silence, right? It's this kind of violence in it. Is this silencing? But my question to you is there room in these texts for this kind of positive silence as well? That silence can be a good place to be, to rest, where you don't have to speak, and so on. Okay, so this is my question for you. I don't know who wants to go first.
If you want to go first, by all means, or I can go. It doesn't matter.
Well, I can say something if you want. Having read more than just small things like these, I think sometimes the Irish people are also very much about succinct brevity. So it's in the efficiency of the people that she talks about, which is the common man, the common woman. For example, in Foster, which is a very positive story actually comparatively, compared to everything apart from the end in small things like this. Foster is entirely quite positive, and it ends. It has to do with a girl who's been taken into foster care by another couple who cannot have their own child, but they are very stern towards her in some ways. They don't say too much, but she spends some time with them and she flourishes. So I think, her stories in some ways are very brief, and she doesn't say too much, but we are allowed to see the love between people through the very brief sentences. So as a reflection of Irish people compared to, for example, Spanish people who say all the time, very much, I think the power of the Irish and some of the Nordics perhaps even and as well is that we don't have to say too much to say it all. And she is very much deep in Irish culture. I think she does find herself very much at home in her county of Wexford where she lives. But also that is exactly where the Fern report was being conducted, that she talks about at some point that I showed in the PowerPoint slide. So behind that sort of stern and harsh on the surface people, she is talking very much about, she's expressing love and affection for her own people as well. And so I think she uses her own imagination to feel and think further. And I think that is also a way for the writer to give us credibility, to not write it in our face, but to give some kind of responsibility for the reader to take it further if we wish. So that is also quite a mature way of approaching the reader in a good way.
Thank you.
But it's a very good point you're making there. So in terms of small things like these, silencing is the negative aspect of silence, for sure. Yeah.
Thank you. Cameron, do you want to go?
Sure. So I talk about pauses, I think I would say in two different ways. The first would be like the pause and saving of a game, which for our Seth, what he talks about this is the ability to, you hit a challenging point in a game, you pause it, you practice it, you play it, and have that kind of repetition. And then you come back to the game in ergodic time. Whereas the practicing was in negotiated time. And there's no real silence at play there, except for the fact that the practicing never kind of translates into the narrative, in the sense that there's no bringing that practice kind of run into the ergodic time of the game, into the storyline that's created. Um, I would take a slightly different route when I talk about the kind of post-structuralist experience of that pausing and playing, in that you're able to now transfer that pause point to somebody else. You can take that save file, give it to somebody else. You're no longer the reader writer of the story. You're now handing that element off. I'm sorry, reader player of the story to somebody else to now construct a whole new narrative, and you've kind of taken a backseat position and silenced yourself. The second way of engaging with pause that's much more in line with silence would be the abandoned storyline. And the abandoned storyline is where you choose to stop playing the game, which our Seth doesn't really engage with as part of the game structure because he's looking at win conditions. For me, I think that the abandoned storyline provides a kind of unique engagement with the game by being a kind of Bartleby-esque prefer not uh, rejection of the narrative structure of the game, which means that you don't actually have to hit the kind of end scene win conditions of the game to provide that retroactive meaning. You can determine when the end of the game happens simply by abandoning it because, like in our Arceus conditions, the game is simply too difficult. You've hit an aporia that you can't overcome, or because you've decided you don't care about satisfying those win conditions. You've done enough to allow for your style of gameplay to challenge the uh, mimetic structures within the game that are trying to reinforce whatever stereotype that your style is attempting to counter.
Thank you. Questions from the audience? So let me ask you again, Cameron, while we wait for others to think. Because I mean, I haven't done any research on computer games. I played a little bit of turn-taking games, like Civilization, not six but one, and, yeah, so I don't know much about this, but let me just pose this as a question to you, right? Say that I play this game and I perceive this game instance, this computer generated algorithm as someone I play with, right? Assuming now it's not a multiplayer game, but I'm just playing with the computer, right? So then I pause this game. Is the game then silent? I mean, is it reasonable to say that the game has now fallen silent because there is, the computer is now not playing against anyone?
um, I would say, okay. I mean, certainly if it's a turn-based strategy game, because you're not taking another turn, there is like end. We could imagine a different game in which the game can kind of play in your absence.
This
Um,
is very interesting.
yeah. The difference in what I would kind of contrast video games with literature or with like the conventional narrative is that the conventional narrative has this pre-written story that's there independent of the reader or player of that story. When you take a step back from the video game, you no longer are part of that reader player relationship, the ergodic relationship with the game. Our set does talk about, and it wasn't quite in line with the structures that I was engaging with for this paper, but he does talk about, um, I think is it the Doomsday Clock? It was a program that existed, I want to say in the 90s. Well, it had to be the 90s. He wrote his first book in the 90s, that like auto-generated poetry. And it would do so independent of you actually like witnessing it. So the moment the poem was written, if you didn't observe it, it just disappeared. And so in that sense, there's kind of like, yes, something can be written. The question then becomes, does it have any kind of meaning or significance? In the context of the relationships that I'm talking about with the politics of video games, I would argue that that doesn't really happen, because there's no combative element between you coming up against the strategic mechanisms in the game that are trying to disciplinize your play style. Does that answer what you were? asking?
It does answer something. I'm trying to make a connection here to a discussion we had earlier this morning before you logged on with Professor Myron about the possibility of these kind of technologies playing themselves without the human, sort of obliterating the human, and the game continues. It's like a completely automated civilization kind of that, doesn't require the human anymore. If that, if you can imagine this kind of futuristic, domain.
Well, you do get, and this again, at the moment where it kind of comes back, well, let me back up. Okay. There are game like mechanics that operate independent of the player experience that then return back to the player experience. So what I mean by that would be like AI learning mechanisms or machine learning mechanisms to figure out like optimal ways to play the game that then create more realistic or more challenging gameplay when you play against it. So the way machine learning will work in a game space is that the machine will play just kind of brute forcing. Okay, if I jump now, do I succeed? Yes, then I'll jump here from now on. If I fail, then I don't. And it just keeps kind of doing that over and over and over in every given situation to find like the optimal permutation of a way to play. And then when you go up against that machine learning, bot, it will be substantially more difficult for you to play against because it has figured out an optimized strategy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find that absolutely fascinating. Let's talk about it more sometime when we have the time. I think now we should take a 5-minute break before we go into Christopher's keynote, which will run off our conference. So let's take a pause for 5 minutes. Okay.